Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is my Valentine's Day gift to climate alarmists. Breaking news, January 2020 was the hottest January in recorded history, NOAA says. And just look at this map. The Earth is burning up. Everything is red hot. And it's from an official government agency, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, so it must be true. We're being barraged with messages day after day that if we don't stop using fossil fuels, we're all going to burn up and die. But meanwhile, back in the real world, this is the temperature forecast map for North America for the next 10 days. Much of North America is going to be between 10 and 20 degrees below normal. Without fossil fuels for our heat, light, cooking, transportation, communication, and just about everything else in our lives, we'd be in pretty bad shape. If fossil fuels were not available, the hundreds of millions of people in North America would be out chopping down the forests and burning the trees in order to try to stay warm. Nobody would be obsessing over bright red government temperature maps because they'd be too busy trying to keep themselves from freezing to death. The only reason that people have the luxury of obsessing over maps like this is because they're kept comfortable by fossil fuels. We have a couple generations of people now who've never had to deal with being cold, hungry, or lacking transportation, communications, or light. Many people take these luxuries for granted and don't seem to understand that the only reason they're not freezing to death is because they have fossil fuels to keep them warm. I took this picture yesterday when I was out cycling around Boulder, Colorado, and I didn't really feel like I was burning up. Now let's take a closer look at NOAA's record hot January. This map shows where NOAA actually has thermometers on the land surface. There's several things I want to point out. The gray areas represent missing data. Note that there are a lot of regions in Africa with no data, very little data in Greenland, and almost none in Antarctica. The really interesting thing on this map, though, is that almost all of the heat was located in Russia and Siberia. Let's take a look now at what temperatures actually are in Siberia. You can see that there's a lot of cold in the Arctic, and it's minus 36 degrees Fahrenheit in Siberia, which NOAA says is about 10 degrees above average. So these areas which they're showing as red hot are actually extremely cold. And then the press gets a hold of the story and says that minus 36 degrees in Siberia is record hot. The only reason that people can be so ridiculous is because they're sitting in a nice warm fossil fuel powered office and don't have to deal with reality. Now, instead of looking at NOAA's red hot map, let's look at some more accurate satellite data. This satellite data from the University of Alabama at Huntsville shows that there was a warm spot in Western Europe and there was one in parts of Russia and Siberia, but not the huge red spot like shown in the NOAA map. Also note that there's nothing alarming about this satellite map and that Greenland was extremely cold. In fact, last month Greenland recorded their coldest temperature on record, which was minus 86.8 degrees Fahrenheit. But somehow NOAA managed to miss the record cold in Greenland. And they also created very warm temperatures through here where they didn't actually exist. This is the map which NOAA releases to the public, which purports to show that they have good coverage all over the Earth. But as we've already seen, that simply isn't true. In this 2009 ClimateGate email from Phil Jones at the University of East Anglia in England, he said, "For much of the southern hemisphere between 40 and 60 south, the temperature normals are mostly made up as there's very little ship data there." This tells us that a lot of these southern hemisphere ocean temperature anomalies are calculated from fake data. And a lot of the land temperatures are fake too. NOAA shows that they have coverage all over Africa, but as we saw from the land-only map, they don't. Most of Africa is gray, meaning that they have no data. So on the map which is released to the public, much of the data is simply fake. There's a lot of problems with the credibility of this map. Much of the data is simply fake. Now we're going to look at the NOAA maps from last February. They created record warm in South America where there actually wasn't any data. They turned cold parts of Australia warm. And they erased extremely cold weather in Russia, just like they did in Greenland this year. These maps from NOAA are propaganda, not science. Now we're going to turn our focus to the United States, which is where NOAA is located. This map shows where NOAA has daily temperature records from 1891 to 1920. You can see that the vast majority of them are in the United States. They have some in Western Europe and some in Australia. But most of the world has no high-quality data prior to 1920. Global temperature graphs from before 1920, and even much more recently than that, are pretty much meaningless. There isn't enough valid data to construct a meaningful long-term global temperature graph. This graphic from the 2017 National Climate Assessment was released to the public as their main communication tool. We're now going to look at three of the graphs. One is U.S. heat waves starting in the 1960s, another is Arctic ice starting in 1979, and the third graph is U.S. wildfire burn acreage starting in 1983. They started one graph in 1960, another in 1979, and a third in 1983. Now we're going to look at how they cherry-picked those three different start dates. First, here's the heat wave graph starting in the 1960s. And here are the more complete graphs from the National Climate Assessment, which were not widely read by the press and politicians. These graphs show heat waves back to the year 1900. It's pretty clear from these graphs that U.S. summers were considerably hotter prior to the year 1960. So now we can see why the graphic which went out to the press and policymakers cherry-picked the 1960s for their start date. This graphic overlays the policymaker graph in red with the complete data set in black. By cherry-picking the start date of the 1960s, they were able to create the appearance of a warming trend, when in fact the long-term trend was actually cooling. The final documents of the National Climate Assessment was clearly intended to mislead and defraud the public. I generated this graphic of the percent of days above 95 degrees Fahrenheit at all United States Historical Climatology Network stations, which have been active since at least July 1936. As you can see, the percent of hot days in the United States has plummeted over the last century. The people who released the final documents of the National Climate Assessment don't want the public to know about America's hot past, so they cherry-picked a start date in 1960s when it was cold. Now let's move on to sea ice. This is today's Arctic sea ice map from the National Snow and Ice Data Center here in Boulder, Colorado. It shows that current sea ice extent is very close to the 1981 to 2010 median edge, which is shown in orange, which in other words means that Arctic sea ice extent is, by the Alarmists' own definition, normal. And this graph is also from the National Snow and Ice Data Center. It shows that Arctic sea ice extent in blue is growing very rapidly. It's equal to the 2001 to 2010 average and well above the 2011 to 2019 average. Ice extent is currently higher than 13 of the last 15 years, and it's growing very fast. But that's not the message you get from the National Climate Assessment graph. The National Climate Assessment graph shows Arctic sea ice declining linearly since a start date of 1979. But why did they pick a start date of 1979 instead of the 1960s like they did with the temperature graph? Let's take a look now at how they cherry-picked the start date of 1979. This news release is from the United Nations Environment Program, 14 October 2019. Satellite record shows second lowest Arctic sea ice extent since 1979. And then they say, 1979 is the beginning of satellite monitoring. Well, that sounds like a good reason to pick a start date of 1979, except for the fact that it isn't true. This document is the United Nations 1990 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. It shows Arctic sea ice extends all the way back to the early 1970s when it was well below the 1979 peak. And this is the text which went with the graph. Satellite observations have been used to map sea ice extent routinely since the early 1970s. The American Navy Joint Ice Center has produced weekly charts which have been digitized by NOAA. In 1972 to 1975, sea ice extent was significantly less. And these images from the November 1976 issue of National Geographic show the very detailed satellite mapping of sea ice which was done prior to 1979. So what the National Climate Assessment and the United Nations did was they lied about not having satellite data prior to 1979 and hid all the inconvenient data during that time period. This graph from the 1985 DOE report was created by Vinnikov, the same guy who created the graph in the 1990 IPCC report. The DOE report was the predecessor to the IPCC report. It showed Arctic sea ice extents all the way back to 1925. And you can see that there was a precipitous decline from the 1920s until the 1950s, and then it started increasing again. In this graphic, I combined the 1985 DOE graph on the left with the 1990 IPCC graph on the right. And now it becomes very clear why government agencies lied about not having data prior to 1979. They cherry-picked their start at the high point of the last century. And to bring this a little closer to home, the coldest winters on record in the United States occurred in 1977, 1978, and 1979. The Arctic was very cold in the late 1970s, which was causing extreme cold in the United States. Thus, 1979 was the perfect cherry-pick year for Arctic alarmists to start their sea ice graphs. It was so cold then that in January 1977 it actually snowed in Miami. But it wasn't always like that in the Arctic. In 1958 it was very warm and the sea ice was disappearing rapidly. The New York Times predicted that the Arctic would be ice-free within a generation. Now let's compare that 1958 New York Times article to the Vinnikov graphs. Sure enough, ice extent was very low during the 1950s. So all of this inconvenient data prior to 1979 is hidden in the National Climate Assessment because it completely wrecks their story. Now we're going to look at one more graphic from the National Climate Assessment. It shows U.S. wildfires increasing since the 1980s. Now I'm going to show you why they cherry-picked a different start date for this graph. This graph from the U.S. Forest Service shows burn acreage all the way back to the year 1916. And you can see that prior to the 1980s, burn acreage was much higher. So I overlaid the National Climate Assessment graph on top of the U.S. Forest Service graph, and you can see exactly what they did. The National Climate Assessment graph is this little inset here in orange. What they did was they cherry-picked the lowest point on record in the last century and chose that as their start date. And in doing so, they hit all the very high burn years of the 1930s. The pink on this graph shows all of the data which they hid. Climate alarmists have tried to make the excuse that people didn't know how to count burn acreage prior to the year 1983, but the fact of the matter is that they're wrong. These articles from the 1930s, which is when they built the Golden Gate Bridge, show that burn acreage was counted very precisely during the 1930s. It turns out that the people who built the Golden Gate Bridge and split the atom in the 1930s were actually much more competent than modern climate scientists. This graphic was the key document from the National Climate Assessment, the one which was used by the press. The graphs of U.S. heat waves, sea ice extent, and U.S. wildfires were intentionally misleading and showed the exact opposite of what the long-term trend actually is. Other graphs on this page have different serious issues, but I'll save those for another video. It's Valentine's Day though, and I'm not upset about this, so I want to send my love to the bureaucrats who created this wildly fraudulent document. You climate fraudsters are the best because you give me lots of good material to make videos about. Happy Valentine's Day. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.